Hello everyone, and welcome to this lovely day of June 12th, 2021. And I give all of you who decided to join us a hearty welcome to Aroace Homestucks present How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Discuss Quadrants. Now, unless you've been living under a rock, or you're someone super new who hasn't gotten to Act 5 yet, or looked at any troll-related content whatsoever, I'll assume you're aware of what quadrants are. But if you aren't, well, it's a little complicated. Or at least it can be. But no need to worry. For anyone who isn't up to speed on what the deal with quadrants is, I'm more than happy to give a brief explanation. And to all of you knowledge fans out there in the audience who I know must be rolling your eyes at me for bringing up this old running gag, well, hey, I'm allowed to have my fun. Now, let's try to understand. The problem is that when the subject of troll romance is broached, our sparing human intellects instantly assume the most ingratiating posture of surrender imaginable. But we will do our best to understand regardless. Andrew Hussey. To put it as briefly as possible, quadrants are a set of parameters for romantic relationships for the alien species known as trolls. Unlike for humanity, which largely has one idea of romantic inclination, trolls have 4 separate ideals for romantic relationships, which are separated into the 4 romantic quadrants. Matespritship, the flushed quadrant, is the closest to what a human might consider a romantic relationship. Flowers, chocolates, long walks on the beach dates, everything that a layperson might consider to be romantic. Moirallegiance, the pale quadrant, is sometimes considered a platonic soulmate, 2 people who comfort each other and keep them emotionally stable. If you want, you may consider it a queer platonic relationship, though trolls do consider it a romantic quadrant nonetheless. Kismasism, the pitch quadrant, is basically if you took an anime rivalry and made them kiss. So, kind of just an anime rivalry. You want to punch someone as much as you want to kiss them, and push each other to your limits in the interest of competition. Lastly, auspicism, the Ashen quadrant, is a bit of a mediator quadrant. Largely in use when pitch emotions are involved, their role is to stabilize an incredibly volatile relationship and prevent the 2 parties from entering a full-on pitch relationship with one another. There, now with the unnecessary running gags out of the way, let's get to the meat of the panel, shall we? While there's no doubt that people of all sorts have their own views and opinions of the quadrants, as a person on the Aroace spectrum, I was curious to hear the opinions of other people with similar identities to my own. Hence why I wanted to put together this panel, to share and hear the opinions of other Aroace spectrum members of the Homestuck fandom on one of my favorite parts of Homestuck. Now, let us get started properly. We'll begin with some introductions of the participants of the panel, just to get to know them a bit before we dive right in.
Hello, my name is Ghastly Ghiffin. I identify as Aroace, and I've been into Homestuck since around 2017-ish.
My name is Jonaya Riley. I am an aromantic asexual lesbian. I use she, her pronouns, and I've been into Homestuck for a little over 2 years now.
Hi, my name is Emily, and I identify as Aroace. Now, the day I got into Homestuck, it's actually pretty embarrassing. I actually got into it on April 13th, 2016, the day it ended. Yeah, I'm really late to the fandom, I'll admit. But I'd heard about Homestuck previously in high school, although not in much detail, and whenever I asked, where can I buy the book, where can I read it, I was always told, no, it's online. At the time, I was only familiar with one other webcomic, but I didn't really have much interest in pursuing Homestuck at the time. But I'm really glad that I made my friends in college because they were the ones who told me, oh, you would love Homestuck. But it's really long, and maybe it's best for you to wait until it ends, because it's coming up soon, and when you can start, we can help you through the whole process. And I was like, okay, that sounds like a plan. The very same time they were watching Act 7 drop, I started reading Act 1 of Homestuck, and I was hooked really fast. I loved everything, the characters, the music, the growing complexity of the story and the narrative, and anytime I had a question whatsoever about the story or the characters or weird random trivia my friends knew, they were right there, and we got closer through Homestuck, and I'm really grateful for it. And later on, I made other friends through the online fandom of Homestuck.
Hello, I'm Gal. I'm the head of this panel. I identify as demi-romantic, demisexual. I got into Homestuck probably sometime in 2016 or 2017. I think I may have learned a bit about Homestuck sometime in high school just through sheer internet osmosis, but it wasn't until college that I got into it. Once I was, though, I was hooked. The potential for world building, the game mechanics, and, most especially, the quadrants. It all created such a wellspring of potential and creativity. I just got really deep really quickly. It's definitely helped that I've met some really great people through it along the way. To start with the real questions, which quadrants do you find most personally interesting?
Actually, I think every quadrant besides plain, boring mate spiritship has potential. Loyals are a more emotionally supportive relationship and apparently non-sexual. The pacification angle is mostly for troll society's benefit, but it'd probably help with normal anger issues and trauma. Kismicitude is a fun idea if it's done properly, a sort of flirtatious rivalry or hatred and respect mixed into an odd, volatile love. And auspitism is frankly underused, mostly because of how situational it is. Still, having sort of Kismesis referee to keep the other two from getting too deep into the hatred or love sides of a relationship has both dramatic and comedic potential.
I personally find all of the quadrants about equally interesting, although I think that the pale quadrant in particular is very underrepresented when it comes to people actually writing about ships that involve the quadrant itself.
When it comes to the quadrants of Homestuck, I think my two favorites would be More Allegiance and Kismicism. With the More Allegiance, I see the whole, I want you to be a better person and I'm going to help you. I'm going to ground you into reality and we're going to figure it out brick by brick to try and make each other happier and become the best versions of ourselves. It's a deep level of intimacy that you feel with the person, where you feel comfortable sharing all your flaws and insecurities with them, because you know they're not going to judge you for them, that they'll help you through your problems, just as you will for them. With the Kismicism, I actually kind of see a similarity with it in More Allegiance. For both relationships, it seems that bettering each other is a key goal for a successful partnership. With the Kismicism, your partner isn't going to be sweet about it. They're going to be very upfront and confrontational about it, saying, you have this flaw. It really annoys me, so I'm going to push you into overcoming it. And while it can seem very forceful at times, I think there's a deep level of admiration that goes on between both parties, because they can see the kind of person that they are and they like qualities about them, yet feel annoyed by the flaws that they have at the same time, so they decide to step up and point these out in a very confrontational way, creating the urge to become a better version of yourself. And after all, they do say spite's an excellent motivator.
To be honest, I think all the quadrants are fascinating in how they operate within the world they were made for. But were I to narrow it down, I think the most personally interesting quadrant to me is Kismicism. Kismicism is really fascinating to me on account of it's really such an interesting exploration into attraction and how people show care for each other. They do say that hate and love are two sides of the same coin, and it really is a quadrant that exhibits that. Two people who can't stand each other, who push and test and annoy one another to no end. Yet, at the end of the day, they really couldn't picture a life without each other. They want each other to be better. and they listen one way or another to the kind of pushing only this deeply held rival can provide. What do you think are positives and negatives about the quadrant system?
Honestly, fandoms outside of Homestuck should try using quadrant relationships more often. It offers a more versatile approach to shipping since it applies to a wider range of relationships than just plain basic love. Sam and Max, the freelance police, Moirails, Agatha, Gil, and Tarvek from Girl Genius, vacillating auspicism mate spirit ship. Unleash your shipping potential with the power of non-Homestuck quadrant shipping today. However, I do feel the whole forcing a mate spirit ship and cosmetics for reproductive purposes thing canon does is just imagine normativity of extra steps. Fast error adding stuff like withdrawal symptoms to the mix doesn't really help either.
I think that the quadrant system provides a very useful shorthand for different kinds of relationships, and in universe it's used as a method of social control where the quadrants and the relationship between them are used by the Empire as a way of controlling individuals' relationships with each other. I don't think that it's inherently a system of control. I think it can be used as a way of describing relationships between individuals as well.
When it comes to the four suits of quadrants, I see them as both a positive and a negative. From a positive standpoint, with the four quadrants, matespacism, more allegiance, schismacism, and auspicism, it offers very distinct guidelines of how a relationship can work and allows someone to better identify how a certain character feels towards a person or could feel towards a person, depending on whether you're analyzing or writing something. It kind of reminds me of how some people will turn towards a specific identity under the LGBTQ community to figure out who they are as a person and to have that label that makes them feel comfortable with themselves. On the other hand, it can be a negative because having these strict guidelines means that if something isn't falling under these troll societal standards, it can be considered other and difficult. Sometimes relationships don't always work out, like when someone's constantly flipping back and forth between pitch and flush, or if there's pale undertones to a schismatic relationship. In the similar way that our emotions can constantly be changing, and so too can our identities. And I think having these guidelines means that if we don't fall under the neatly packaged ideas of what a relationship can be, we can be considered other or even feel inadequate for not measuring up to these standards. In this way, I think the quadrants offer a lot of reference points, but at the same time, we shouldn't feel limited to strictly write about the quadrants, and we can definitely go outside their borders at times.
I think that the quadrant system definitely has its benefits. I know that there's some Aroace Spectrum people who subscribe to the split attraction model. Not all of them, but enough I find it reasonable enough to mention. And I think the quadrants work really well into that. Sometimes it can feel helpful to define how you feel about people, just like it can help when defining yourself on a much more personal level. But I think there's definitely some level of comfort in knowing the different ways you can be drawn to people. Though, like with any kind of social norm, even for aliens, it does come with its drawbacks. While it isn't as much an issue for humans, for trolls it can definitely be a limiting factor. If a troll doesn't fit into certain quadrants, whether sticking with one or even just sticking to defined quadrants while vacillating, it can lead to issues of connection and even outright ostracization within troll society. So within a system where the definitions are super strict, it can definitely be something very restricting and difficult for those who don't ascribe to them fully to handle. How do you think the fandom tends to view quadrants?
I can't say for certain how the fandom tends to view quadrants since I don't use forums and read fics that much, but aside from the whole use quadrants and other fandoms for bonus fun thing, I'd say just don't hyperfixate on applying a quadrant relationship to everything. I know that sounds kind of paradoxical to the last thing, but A lot of times folks reach for any and all methods of inserting more relationships into a story already packed to the sea dweller gills of relationship drama, when sometimes a nice platonic bond is all you need.
I don't know that the fandom has a specific view of quadrants as a good or a bad thing. I've heard kind of both ends of it, where you have people that say that they are inherently a negative system. Most people seem to enjoy them and like using them as a way of categorizing relationships between characters and describing dynamics between the characters.
I typically stay outside of fandom drama, but I like to believe that, as a whole, the fandom is largely positive with quadrants. As I addressed earlier, I think a lot of us like the aspect of quadrants being so orderly and tidy and neatly defined that we can explore different thoughts and feelings through them, able to explore relationships in a way that is outside our typical norm, and to better explore the feelings that they can include and how different relationships can form, such as how a kismicism can be emotionally positive and not unhealthy, how a more allegiance is considered just as important as a stereotypical romantic relationship that we're used to, that platonic is just as important. I think we as a whole love to explore these different topics and to figure out and express our own selves through them.
In general, I think the fandom views the quadrants very positively. People in and even outside the Homestuck fandom have seemed to have fun with identifying certain relationships within quadrant boundaries, whether between fictional characters they ship together, or even people in real life who have defined themselves with quadranted terms. Though I won't say I've only ever seen a universally positive view. I have certainly seen some people who are of the opinion that quadrants are an inherently unhealthy system that places limits on relationships, in similar ways as real-life society tends to be restrictive unless towards heterosexual monogamous relationships with the intent of producing children. Though for the most part I don't interact too deeply with spaces where people hold those views more often, so I don't think I can judge how much of a majority or minority such people are. I at least like to believe that people hold a generally more positive opinion on quadrants overall than that. Do you think quadrants are inherently healthier when vacillation or quadrant blurring are involved? Or can quadrants that stay solely within the typical confines of their quadrant still be healthy?
On the one hand, being rigidly stuck in one method of expressing attraction would probably be an uncomfortable situation for some people, so I understand the appeal of vacillation. However, despite all the imaginonormative bullshit mainstream media pumps out about the one and soulmates and all that nonsense, I do think that people and characters can maintain a lasting, healthy relationship while remaining within confines of a single quadrant.
I don't think the concepts of blurring or vacillation between the quadrants inherently make for a healthier or less healthy relationship. I think that the healthiness of the relationship has to do with the individuals involved and a lot of other factors in the dynamics between them, whereas the quadrants kind of describe the relationship itself and how they feel about each other, and quadrant vacillation and blurring are additional modifiers that help to describe that relationship in more detail. I think that it's perfectly possible for a relationship to exist within the quadrants and still be a healthy relationship. I think that the health of the relationship is determined by the way that the participants all interact with each other, rather than by the specific type of feelings that they experience for each other.
On a personal standpoint, I think that quadrant blurring and quadrant vacillation are extremely healthy towards a troll relationship. While it's good to have a set definition of how your relationship is, I also think that the characters that we explore constantly go through change and personal growth as the story progresses. The changes they go through can often lead to revelations and realizations that they have towards their current partner, Maybe they realize their feelings are changing, or that they're identifying new qualities about this person as they too change and adapt, that they find more attractive or they want to help improve upon. It allows them to better explore their relationships and feelings and figure out how they want to be in the future, if they want to stay with this person, and if so, what are these changes going to mean for them? It just makes me think a lot about our own personal changes and experiences in life, and how we can reflect them through writing about these different vacillations.
I think, just like in any real-life relationship, a quadrant-based relationship has no strictly healthy or unhealthy states of being. It's like two people being in love, getting married, and having the little picket fence house, 2.5 kids suburban paradise is a societal norm in most places, and is based in a lot of different elements that can have negative historical implications. But people can be and are happy in such relationships. I think the same goes for quadrants. In a scenario where quadrants are a guideline, rather than a hard rule with social punishment as a result of straying from the norm, quadrants aren't an inherently bad thing. It all really depends on an individual's personal needs and desires, and those of any involved partners. Maybe a blurred quadrant relationship is better for them. Maybe a relationship within a singular unchanging quadrant makes them happier. As long as the people involved are happy, I think that's all that matters. Do you believe there can be queer platonic relationships within the boundaries of the quadrants?
The idea of queer platonic relationships is fascinating, since it offers even more potential for variation than simply blurring or vacillating. Perhaps a polyamorous osmotism of numerous rivals and referees, or a rivals of benefits less intense version of gizmesis. Without the mandated obligation for drones to consistently reproduce, I'm sure exploration of such relationships would flourish, and most likely in situations like Earth-C.
So I think that there are kind of two ways of describing the quadrants as far as how you account for queer platonic relationships and forms of attraction that aren't romantic or sexual. My understanding is that the Moirail relationship is essentially analogous to a queer platonic relationship. Personally, I don't think that the quadrants describe a wholly different type of feeling. I think that they are just basically analogs for human relationships. So the trolls have the same kind of feelings that humans do. They just have this social structure. That describes their relationships in a very specific way. So I think it's possible to interpret queer platonic relationships as being within a quadrant, i.e., you have a certain type of relationship that's defined by the quadrant, but then you have the queer platonic relationship indicating that those feelings aren't romantic or sexual. But I think that the fact that there is a quadrant that essentially describes queer platonic feelings makes that categorization a little bit tricky. Like, are you implying that Moirails are a romantic or sexual quadrant? And, like, the use of the term romance from Moirails is also kind of a confusing factor here. But I don't necessarily think that was done intentionally in the original work. I think that was the result of a lack of understanding what queer platonic relationships are, rather than some kind of, like, deeper statement about the actual nature of those relationships.
I believe that queer platonic relationships can be a thing within the quadrant system itself. The troll definition of a queer platonic relationship would most likely be different considering their status of more allegiance, but I don't think that they would be limited to just the 4 quadrants. I think that they would find a way to blend certain things. Or maybe the definition of a troll queer platonic relationship would involve 2 separate parties but are connected by the same troll through opposing quadrants, yet these 2 individuals are not affiliated via a quadrant, creating a cohabitable relationship between one another that is not defined by the standard rules of the quadrant. Whatever the case, I think there's great potential in theorizing about troll queer platonic relationships and getting the chance to explore them, whether through writing or discussion within fandom and friends. So just explore it and have fun. We have a big sandbox to play in, so we shouldn't feel limited.
To be fair, more allegiance can already be seen in the context of a human view as a queer platonic relationship. It's a relationship with a lot of heavily platonic elements that still maintains a level of connection and dedication usually reserved for a more romantic relationship. And the issue of that definition is definitely confounded more by more allegiance being defined as a romantic relationship in the initial context of Quadrants when used by trolls. But I think it would definitely be an interesting concept to explore in the context of troll society specifically, or even in usage of non-troll species who use such quadrants in some form or another. Could there be a deviation of norms and social rules regarding moirails that could be seen by trolls as queer platonic within that quadrant? Is there a way to maintain a normal concupiscent relationship like mate spirits or kismesis in a queer platonic way? The whole concept is fascinating to me, and definitely one I'd love to explore more in some way in the future. Well, I suppose that about wraps it up here. It's been a lot of fun hearing people share their thoughts on quadrants, and sharing my own thoughts, of course. I'd like to give a big thanks to the people who have agreed to help me run this panel. It's been a lot of fun to put together, and I hope all of you enjoyed participating as much as I enjoyed running it. You're all really wonderful people, and it was a joy to work with you all. Now, I could probably give some heartfelt speech thanking you all for joining us, or some deep and thoughtful analysis of how we should all appreciate quadrants as a fictional concept, however we believe in them or not, as a thought-provoking analysis of romance and connections within a fictional alien world that they are. But, in place of that, I think it's only fitting that I finish up this panel with what can only be described as one of the most infamous and thought-provoking pieces of prose that Homestuck has to offer. The sun threatens to set, but won't step off. It's staring you down, like the big red eye of a hot needle, skipping on a groove it's tracing round the earth. While lingering in midair, its heat seems to suspend time itself, stretching it like warped vinyl. It's meant to rain this season, but there ain't been a drop in sight. Even a little drizzle would help. Might help to fizzle this sizzle a little bizzle. Set the record straight on this global turn-tizzle. So don't change the dizzle. Turn it up a little. I got a living room full of fine dime brizzles, waiting on the pizzle, the dizzle, and the shizzle. G's to the bizac. Now ladies, here we gizzo. When the pimp's in the crib, ma, drop it like it's hot. Drop it like it's hot. Drop it like it's hot. English Romantic poet, John Keats. Thank you very much for attending the panel. I hope you've enjoyed yourself for your time of hearing us talk about quadrants. May you have an enjoyable rest of your day, and I hope you'll enjoy the rest of SAHcon 2021.